Approved for release 2023, September 10. CIA RDIP 96-0078R001700210016-5. Department of the Army, U.S. Army Operational Group, U.S. Army Intelligence and Security Command, Fort George G. Meade, Maryland, 20755. 9th June 1983. Subject: Analysis and Assessment of Gateway Process. To Commander, U.S. Army Operational Group, Fort Meade, Maryland, 20755. 1. You tasked me to provide an assessment of the Gateway experience in terms of its mechanics and ultimate practicality. As I set out to fulfill that task, it soon became clear that in order to assess the validity and practicality of the process, I needed to do enough supporting research and analysis to fully understand how and why the process works. Frankly, sir, that proved to be an extremely involved. Initially, based on conversations with a physician who took the Gateway training with me, I had recourse to the biomedical models developed by Itzhak Bentov to obtain information concerning the physical aspects of the process. Then I found it necessary to delve into various sources for information concerning quantum mechanics in order to be able to describe the nature and functioning of human consciousness. I had to be able to construct a scientifically valid and reasonably lucid model of how consciousness functions under the influence of the brain hemisphere synchronization technique employed by Gateway. Once this was done, the next step involved recourse to theoretical physics in order to explain the character of the time-space dimension and the means by which expanded human consciousness transcends it in achieving Gateway's objectives. Finally, I again found it necessary to use physics to bring the whole phenomenon of out-of-body states into the language of physical science to remove the stigma of its occult connotations and put it in a frame of reference suited to objective assessment. 2. I began the narrative by briefly profiling the fundamental biomedical factors affecting such related techniques as hypnosis, biofeedback, and transcendental meditation, so that their objectives and mode of functioning could be compared in the reader's mind with the Gateway experience as the model of its underlying mechanics was developed. Additionally, that introductory material is useful in supporting the conclusions of the paper. I indicate that at times these related techniques may provide useful entry points to accelerate movement into the Gateway experience. 3. Niels Bohr, a renowned physicist, once responded to his son's complaints about the obtuse nature of certain concepts in physics by saying, quote, "You are not thinking, you are merely being logical," end quote. The physics of altered human consciousness deals with some conceptualizations that are not easily grasped or visualized exclusively in the context of ordinary, quote, left brain, end quote, linear thinking. So, to borrow Dr. Bohr's mode of expression, parts of this paper will require not only logic, but a touch of. End of page 1, beginning page 2. right brain intuitive insight to achieve a complete, comfortable grasp of the concepts involved. Nevertheless, once that is done, I am confident that their construction and application will stand up to the test of rational critique. 4. Paradoxically, having gone to such great lengths to avoid trying to render judgments based on an occult or dogmatic frame of reference, in the end I found it necessary to return, at least briefly, to the question of the impact of the gateway experience on common belief systems. I did so because although it was essential to experience, to that it was necessary after having completed the analysis to point out that the resulting conclusions do not do any violence to the fundamental mainstream of either Eastern or Western belief systems. Unless that point is clearly established, the danger exists that some people will reject the whole concept of the gateway experience in the mistaken belief that it contradicts and is therefore alien to all that they hold to be right and true. This study is certainly not designed to be the last word on the subject, but I hope that the validity of its basic structure and of the fundamental concepts upon which it is based will make it a useful guide for other USAINSCOM personnel who are required to take the gateway training or work with gateway materials. Wayne M. McDonnell, LTC, MI, Commander, DET-O. End of page 2, beginning page 3.
1. Introduction. In order to describe the Monroe Institute technique for achieving altered states of consciousness, the, quote, gateway experience, end quote, involving brain hemisphere synchronization, or, quote, hemisync, end quote, the most effective way to begin is to briefly profile the basic mechanics which underlay operation of related methods, such as hypnosis, transcendental meditation, and biofeedback. It is easiest to effectively describe what gateway is by beginning with a short description of those associated techniques that share some common aspects with the gateway experience, but which are nevertheless different. In this way, we can develop a frame of reference at the outset, which will provide useful concepts to explain and understand gateway by comparison as we proceed. 2. Hypnosis. According to the theories of psychologist Ronald Stone and the biomedical engineering models of Ishak and Talk, hypnosis is basically a technique which permits acquisition of direct access to the sensory motive cortex and pleasure senses, and lower cerebral, emotional portions and associated pleasure centers of the right side of the human brain following successful disengagement of the stimulus screening function of the left hemisphere of the brain. The left hemisphere of the brain is the self-cognitive, verbal, and linear reasoning component of the mind. It fulfills the functions of screening incoming stimuli by categorizing, assessing, and assigning meaning prior to allowing passage to the right hemisphere of the mind. The right hemisphere, which functions as the non-critical, holistic, non-verbal, and pattern-oriented component of the brain, appears to accept what the left hemisphere passes to it without question. Consequently, if the left hemisphere can be distracted either through boredom or through reduction to a soporific semi-sleep state, external stimuli, to include hypnotic suggestions, are allowed to pass unchallenged into the right hemisphere, where they are accepted and acted upon directly. The result may involve an emotional reaction originating in the lower cerebral region, sensory/motor responses requiring involvement of the cortex, and so on. Both sensory and the motor cortices of the right cerebral portion of the brain contain a sequence of points known as the quote, homunculus, unquote, which correspond to points in the body. See Exhibit 1 next page. Stimulation of the corresponding area on the cortex causes immediate response in the associated portion of the body. Consequently, induction of the suggestion that the left leg is numb, if it reaches the right hemisphere unchallenged and is referred to the appropriate area of the sensory cortex, will result in an electrical reaction being generated that will induce the feeling of numbness. Similarly, the suggestion that the person is experiencing a general feeling of happiness and well-being would be referred to the appropriate pleasure centers located in the lower cerebral portion or in the cortex of the right hemisphere, thereby inducing the suggested feeling of euphoria. Finally, suggestions such as one that informs hypnotic subject that he enjoys enhanced concentration or powers of memory would be responded to in the right hemisphere by accessing unused information storage capacity normally held in reserve as a result of left hemisphere selection and control processes. This aspect will become significant in the context of the gateway process when attention is given to examining the way that hypnosis may be used to accelerate progress in the early stages of the gateway experience. Three, transcendental meditation. On the other hand, transcendental meditation works in a distinctly different fashion. In this technique, intense
and protracted single-minded concentration on the process of drawing energy of the spinal cord ultimately results in what appears to be creation of acoustical standing waves in the cerebral ventricles, which are then conducted to the gray matter in the cerebral. End of page 3, beginning page 4. Just some diagrams. Just leave it there briefly and move on to page 5. Cortex on the right side of the brain. As a result, according to Bentov, these waves, quote, will stimulate and eventually, in quote, polarize, end quote, the cortex in such a way that it will tend to conduct a signal along the homunculus, starting from the toes and on up, end quote. The Bentov biomedical model, as described in a book by Lee Sanella, MD, entitled Kundalini Psychosis or Transcendence, states that the standing acoustical waves are the result of the altered rhythm of the heart sounds, which are occasioned by prolonged practice of meditation, which set up sympathetic vibrations in the walls of the fluid-filled cavities, which comprise the third and lateral ventricles of the brain. In addition, according to Bentov, quote, the states of bliss described by those whose Kundalini symptoms have completed the full loop along the hemispheres may be explained as a self-stimulation of the pleasure centers in the brain caused by the circulation of a quote, current end quote, along the sensory cortex end quote. Bentov also notes quote, that more of the described symptoms start on the left side of the brain, left side of the body, means that it is mostly a development occurring in the right hemisphere, end quote. Although normally a period of meditation involves intense concentration and practice for 5 years, or some is required to, quote, bring up the Kundalini, end quote. Bentov states that exposure to mechanical or acoustical vibrations in the range of 4 to 7 Hz cycles per second for protracted periods may achieve the same effect. Bentov cites as an example, quote, repeated riding in a car whose suspension and seat combination produce that range of vibrations, or being exposed for long periods of time to these frequencies, caused, for instance, by an air conditioning duct, end quote. He also notes that, quote, the cumulative effect of these vibrations may be able to trigger a spontaneous physio-kundalini sequence in susceptible people who have a particularly sensitive nervous system, end quote. 4. Biofeedback. The third consciousness altering methodology, which will be briefly described, is biofeedback. Biofeedback is somewhat unique in that it actually employs the self-cognitive powers of the left hemisphere to gain access to such areas of the right brain as the lower cerebral, motor, and sensory cortices and assorted pain or pleasure centers. Instead of suppressing the left hemisphere, as is done in hypnosis, or largely bypassing and ignoring it, as is done in transcendental meditation, biofeedback teaches the left hemisphere first to visualize the desired result, and then to recognize the feelings associated with the experience of successful right hemisphere access to the specific lower cerebral cortex, pain or pleasure, or other areas in such manner needed to produce the desired result. Special self-monitoring devices such as the digital thermometer are used to inform the left brain when it succeeds in keying the right hemisphere into accessing the appropriate area. Once this is done, the left brain can then repeatedly instruct the right brain to reestablish the pathways involved so as to produce the same external objective measures of success. In this way, the pathways are strengthened and emphasized to such an extent that the left brain consciousness is enabled to access appropriate areas in the right brain using a conscious demand mode. For example, if the subject wishes to increase the circulation in the left leg in order to speed up healing, he may concentrate with his left brain on achieving that result while carefully monitoring a digital thermometer connected to the left leg. When the concentrated effort begins to achieve success, the digital thermometer will register an increase in temperature of the left leg. At that point, the subject can mentally left brain associate the sensations experienced with the result achieved and can begin to emphasize by memory recall this same process to cause its strengthening by affirmation and repetition. In this way, pain can be blocked, healing can be enhanced, malignant tumors can apparently be suppressed and ultimately destroyed. The body's pleasure centers can be stimulated, and a variety of specific physiological results may be achieved. In addition, biofeedback may be used to greatly accelerate achievement of deep meditative states, particularly for beginners. End of page 5, beginning page 6. Who have no experience in meditative techniques and whose progress in that methodology is enhanced through effective visualization and external objective affirmation. Display of the subject's brainwave pattern on a cathode ray tube has proven to be a laboratory-validated means by which subjects may quickly learn to place themselves in profoundly relaxed states characterized by the sort of quietude and singularity of mental focus associated with advanced meditation. 5. Gateway and hemisync. Now that we have briefly profiled the basic mechanics of the principal techniques for altering or expanding consciousness, which share some of the objective and/or methods employed in the gateway experience, we may proceed to focus on what the technique actually involves. Fundamentally, the gateway experience is a training system designed to bring enhanced strength, focus, and coherence to the amplitude and frequency of brainwave output between the left and right hemispheres so as to alter consciousness, moving it outside the physical sphere so as to ultimately escape even the restrictions of time and space. The participant then gains access to the various levels of intuitive knowledge which the universe offers. What differentiates the gateway experience from forms of meditation is its use of the hemisync technique, which is defined in a monograph by Monroe Institute trainer Melissa Jagger as, quote, a state of consciousness defined when the EEG patterns of both hemispheres are simultaneously equal in amplitude and frequency, end quote. Although hemisync seems to be rather rare and of only short duration in ordinary human consciousness, Melissa Jaeger states that, quote, audio techniques developed by Bob Monroe can induce and sustain hemisync with the Institute's basic Focus 3 tapes, end quote. She also notes that, quote, studies conducted by Elmer and Alice Green at the Menninger Foundation have shown that a subject with 20 years of training in Zen meditation could consistently establish hemisync at will, sustaining it for over 15 minutes, end quote. Dr. Stuart Twemlow, a psychiatrist and a research associate of the Monroe Institute, reports that, quote, in our studies of the Effect of the Monroe tape system on brain waves. We have found that the tapes encourage the focusing of brain energy. It can be measured as with a light bulb in watts into a narrower and narrower "frequency band". This focusing of energy is not unlike the yoga concept of one-pointedness, which we may translate in Western terms as a single-mindedness. Dr. Twemlow goes on to observe that as the individual gets into the tapes beyond focus 3, there is a gradual increase in brainwave size, which is a measure of brain energy or power. 6. Lamp versus laser. Melissa Jaeger uses a metaphor to help clarify the process involved in the use of hemisync in the gateway experience. She points out that the human mind in its natural state may be likened to an ordinary lamp, which expends energy in the form of both heat and light, but in a chaotic, incoherent way, which diffuses its energy over a wide area of rather limited depth. On the other hand, the human mind, under the discipline of hemisync, acts after the fashion of a laser beam which produces a disciplined stream of light. The stream of energy is projected with total coherence of both frequency and amplitude, such that the surface area of a laser beam contains billions of times the concentrated energy found in a similar surface area on the Sun. Gateway assumes that once the frequency and amplitude of the human brain are rendered coherent, it is possible to begin accelerating both so that the human mind is soon resonating at ever higher vibrational levels. The mind can then bring itself into synchronization with more sophisticated and rarefied energy levels in the universe. The mind, when operating at these increasingly rarefied levels, is assumed to be capable of processing the information thus received through this same fundamental matrix, by which it makes sense of ordinary physical sensory input to achieve meaning in a cognitive context. Such meaning is usually perceived visually in the form of symbols, but may also be perceived as astonishing flashes of holistic intuition, or even in the form, end of page 6, beginning page 7, of scenarios involving both visual and aural perception. The mechanics by which the mind exercises the consciousness function will be addressed in more detail later in this paper. 7. Frequency following response. To achieve synchronization of brain hemispheres, the hemisync technique takes advantage of a phenomenon known as the frequency following response, FFR, which means that if a subject hears a sound produced at a vibration which emulates one of those associated with the operation of the human brain, the brain will try to mimic the same frequency pattern by adjusting its brainwave output. Therefore, if the subject is in a fully awake state but hears sound frequencies which approximates brainwave output at the theta level, the subject's brain will endeavor to alter its brainwave pattern from the normal beta to the theta level. Since the theta level is associated with sleep, the subject concerned may progress from a fully awake to a sleep state, provided that he does not consciously resist, as the brain strives to entrain its wave frequency output with the one which the person hears. Since these brain wave frequencies are outside the spectrum of sounds which can be heard in pure form by the human ear, hemisync must produce them based on another phenomenon known as the brain's capacity for deducing "beat" frequencies. If the human brain is exposed to one frequency in the left ear, which is 10 Hz below another audible frequency played in the right ear, left ear, which is 10, excuse me, rather than hearing either of the two audible frequencies, the brain chooses to "hear" the difference between them, the "beat" frequency, thus availing itself of the FFR, or frequency following response phenomenon, and using the technique of "beat" frequencies. The gateway system uses hemisync and other audio techniques employing the FFR phenomenon to introduce a variety of frequencies which are played at a virtually subliminal, marginally audible level. The objective is to relax the left hemisphere of the brain, place the physical body in a virtual sleep state, and bring the left and right hemispheres into coherence under conditions designed to promote the production of ever higher amplitude and frequency of brain wave output. Audible and perhaps subliminal suggestions by Bob Monroe accompany the various brain wave frequencies, which are sometimes rolled in together with other sounds, such as sea surf, to mask the sound frequencies where desirable. In this way, Gateway endeavors to provide the subject with the tools by which he may alter his consciousness based on his own volition over time through the repetitive use of the tapes, so as to access, via intuitive means, new categories of information not available to ordinary consciousness.
8. Role of resonance. However, brain coherence through entrainment to "beat" frequencies introduced via stereo headphones is only part of the reason why the gateway system works. It is also designed to achieve the physical quietude characteristic of deep transcendental meditative states, which brings about a complete alteration of the fundamental resonance pattern associated with the sound frequencies produced by the human body. Yoga, Zen, or transcendental meditation, if practiced long enough, will produce a change in the sound frequency with which the human heart resonates throughout the entire body. According to Bentov, this change in resonance results from elimination of what the medical profession calls the bifurcation echo, so that the sound of the heartbeat can move synchronously up and down the circulatory system in harmonious resonance approximately 7 times a second. Bentov describes the role played by the bifurcation echo as follows, quote, when the left ventricle of the heart ejects blood, the aorta, being elastic, balloons out just beyond the valve and causes a pressure pulse to travel down along the aorta. When the pressure pulse reaches the bifurcation in the lower abdomen, which is where the aorta forks in two to go into legs, part of the pressure pulse rebounds and starts traveling up the aorta. If in the meantime the heart ejects more blood and a new pressure pulse is traveling down, these two pressure, end of page 7, beginning page 8, points will eventually collide somewhere along the aorta or the aorta and produce an interference pattern, end quote. By placing the body in a sleep-like state, the gateway tapes achieve the same goal as meditation in that it places the body in such a profoundly relaxed state that the bifurcation echo slowly fades away as the heart lessens the force and frequency with which it pushes blood into the aorta. The result is a regular, rhythmic sine wave pattern of sound which echoes throughout the body and rises up into the head in sustained resonance. The amplitude of this sine wave pattern, when measured with a sensitive seismograph type instrument, is about 3 times the average of the sound volume produced by the heart when it is operating normally. 9. Brain stimulation. Bentov's biomedical model shows that this resonance is of considerable importance since it is directly transmitted to and impacts upon the brain. The resulting vibration is received and transmitted into the brain itself via the fluid-filled third and left ventricles located above the brainstem. An electromagnetic pulse is then generated which stimulates the brain to raise the amplitude and frequency of brainwave output. Just as Dr. Twemlow observed in his research on the effects of these hemisync tapes. Also, the brain is contained in a tight membrane called the dura, which is, in turn, the cushion by a thin layer of fluid located between it and the skull. As the coherent resonance produced by the human heart in a state of profound relaxation reaches the fluid layer surrounding the brain, it sets up a rhythmic pattern in which the brain moves up and down approximately 0.005 to 0.010 millimeters in a continuous pattern. The self-reinforcing character of resonant behavior accounts for the body's ability to sustain this movement despite the minimal level of energy involved. In this way, the entire body, based on its own micromotion, functions as a tuned vibrational system which transfers energy in a range of between 6.8 and 7.5 Hertz into the Earth's ionospheric cavity, which itself resonates at about 7 to 7.5 Hertz. Of this process, Bentov states, quote, this is occurring at a very long wavelength of about 40,000 kilometers, or just about the perimeter of the planet. In other words, the signal from the movement of our bodies will travel around the world in about 1/7 of a second through the electrostatic field in which we are embedded. Such a long wavelength knows no obstacles, and its strength does not attenuate much over large distances. Naturally, it will go through just about anything: metal, concrete, water, and the fields making up our bodies. It is the ideal medium for conveying a telepathic signal, end quote. Consequently, the gateway process is designed to rather rapidly induce a state of profound calm within the nervous system and to significantly lower blood pressure, to cause the circulatory system, skeleton, and all other physical organ systems to begin vibrating coherently at approximately 7 to 7.5 cycles per second. The resulting resonance sets up a regular repetitive sound wave which propagates in consonance with the electrostatic field of the Earth. 10. Energy entrainment. As the body is turned into a coherent oscillator, vibrating in harmony with the surrounding electrostatic medium, the specific exercises included in the gateway tapes enjoin the participant to build up the energy field surrounding his body, presumably by using energy from the Earth's field, which the body is now entraining because of its ability to resonate with it. This puts the body's energy field into homogeneity with its surrounding environment and promotes movement of the seat of consciousness into the surrounding environment, partly in response to the fact that the two electromagnetic medians are now a single energy continuum. Thus, the same process which moves the brain into focused. End of page 8, beginning page 9. Coherence at steadily higher levels of frequency and amplitude so as to entrain analogous frequencies in the universe for data collection also promotes enhanced of bodily energy levels to a point adequate to permit the subject to experience an out-of-body movement when he is ready to do so. More will be said about this topic later. In addition, by resonating with the Earth's electromagnetic sphere, the human body creates a surprisingly powerful carrier wave to assist the mind in communication activity with other human minds similarly tuned. 11. Consciousness and energy. Before our explanation can proceed any further, it is essential to define the mechanism by which the human mind exercises the function known as consciousness, and to describe the way in which that consciousness operates to deduce the meaning from the stimuli which it receives. To do this, we will first consider the fundamental character of the material world in which we have our physical existence, in order to accurately perceive the raw stuff with which our consciousness must work. The first point which needs to be made is that the two terms, matter and energy, tend to be misleading if taken to indicate two distinctly different states of existence in the physical world that we know it. Indeed, if the term matter is taken to mean solid substance, as opposed to energy, which is understood to mean a force of some sort, then the use of the former is entirely misleading. Science now knows that both the electrons which spin in the energy field located around the nucleus of the atom and the nucleus itself are made up of nothing more than oscillating energy grids. Solid matter, in the strict construction of the term, simply does not exist. Rather, atomic structure is composed of oscillating energy grids surrounded by other oscillating energy grids, which orbit at extraordinarily high speeds. In his book, Stalking the Wild Pendulum, Itzhak Bentov gives the following figures. The energy grid, which composes the nucleus of the atom, vibrates at approximately 10 to the 22nd power hertz, which means 10 followed by 22 zeros. At 70 degrees Fahrenheit, an atom oscillates at the rate of 10 to the 15th power hertz. An entire molecule composed of a number of atoms bound together in a single energy field vibrates in the range of 10 to the 9 power hertz. A live human cell vibrates at approximately 10 to the 3rd power hertz. The point to be made is that the entire human being, brain, consciousness, and all, is, like the universe which surrounds him, nothing more or less than an extraordinary complex system of energy fields. The so-called states of matter are actually variances in this state of energy, and human consciousness is a function of the interaction of energy in two opposite states, motion versus rest. In a matter described in the following paragraph. 12. Holograms. Energy creates, stores, and retrieves meaning in the universe by projecting or expanding at certain frequencies in the three-dimensional mode that creates a living pattern called a hologram. The concept of the hologram can be most easily understood by using an example cited by Bentov, in which he asks the reader to visualize a bowl full of water, into which 3 pebbles are dropped. As the ripples created by the simultaneous entry of the 3 pebbles radiate outward toward the rim of the bowl, Bentov further asks the reader to visualize that the surface of the water is suddenly flash frozen so that the ripple pattern is preserved instantly. The ice is removed, leaving the 3 pebbles still laying at the bottom of the bowl. Then the ice is exposed to a powerful, coherent source of light, such as a laser. The result will be a three-dimensional model or representation of the position of the 3 pebbles the 3 pebbles suspended in midair. Holograms are capable of encoding so much detail that, for example, it is possible to take a holographic projection of a glass of swamp water and view it under magnification to see small organisms not visible to the naked eye when the glass of water itself is examined. The whole concept of holography, despite its scientific implications, has only been known to the physicists since the underlying mathematical principles were worked out by Dennis Gabor in 1947. He later won a Nobel Prize for his work. End of page 9, beginning page 10. Laboratory demonstration of Gabor's work will only occur years later following invention of the laser. As biologist Lyle Watson explains, quote, "The purest kind of light available to us is that produced by a laser, which sends out a beam in which all the waves are of one frequency, like those made by an ideal pebble in a perfect pond. When 2 laser beams touch, they produce an interference pattern of light and dark ripples that can be recorded on a photographic plate. And if one of the beams, instead of coming directly from the laser, is reflected first off an object such as a human face, the resulting pattern will be very complex indeed, but it can still be recorded. The record will be a hologram of the face, end quote. 13. The part encodes the whole. Of further importance is the fact that even if we dropped our frozen hologram of the ripple pattern on the floor and broke it into a number of pieces, each individual piece would recreate the entire holographic image all by itself. The smaller the piece, the fuzzier and more distorted would be the resulting holographic projection. But the fact remains that a whole projection would nonetheless be made. The key to creating any hologram is that energy in motion must interact with energy in a state of rest, non-motion. In the foregoing example, the pebbles represent energy in motion, while the water, before its agitation by the pebbles, represents energy at a state of rest. To activate, or in effect, to, quote, perceive, end quote, the meaning of a holograph, energy, in this case a coherent light source such as a laser beam, must be passed through the interference pattern generated by the interaction between the moving energy and the energy at rest. In the simple example given by Bentov, this requirement was fulfilled by holding the frozen interference pattern in front of the coherent light to project the three-dimensional holographic image, its, quote, meaning, end quote, into space. As Marlon Ferguson, editor of the Brain/Mind Bulletin, tells us, quote, another feature of the hologram is its efficiency. Billions of bits of information can be stored in a tiny space. The pattern of the holographic, in brackets, photo, end brackets, is stored everywhere on the plate, end quote. 14. The consciousness matrix. The universe is composed of interacting energy fields, some at rest and some in motion. It is, in and of itself, one gigantic hologram of unbelievable complexity. According to the theories of Carl Pribram, a neuroscientist at Stanford University, and David Bohm, a physicist at the University of London, the human mind is also a hologram which attunes itself to the universal hologram by the medium of energy exchange, thereby deducing meaning and achieving the state which we call consciousness. With respect to states of expanded or altered consciousness, such as gateway uses, the process operates in the following way. As energy passes through various aspects of the universal hologram and is perceived by the electrostatic fields which comprise the human mind, the holographic images being conveyed are projected upon those electrostatic fields of the mind and are perceived or understood to the extent that the electrostatic field is operating at a frequency and amplitude that can harmonize with, and therefore, quote, read, end quote, the energy carrier wave pattern passing through it. Change in the frequency and amplitude of the electrostatic field, which comprises the human mind, determines the configuration and hence the character of the holographic energy matrix, which the mind projects to intercept meaning directly from the holographic transmissions of the universe. Then, to make sense of what the holographic image is, quote, saying, end quote, to it, the mind proceeds to compare the image just received with itself. Specifically, it does this by comparing the image received with that part of its own hologram, which constitutes memory. By registering differences in end of page 10, beginning page 11. Geometric form and in energy frequency, the consciousness perceives, see Exhibit 2, next page. As psychologist Keith Floyd puts it, quote, contrary to what everyone knows is so, it may not be the brain that produces consciousness, but rather consciousness that creates the appearance of the brain, end quote. Brain in phase. The consciousness process is most easily envisaged if we picture the holographic input with a three-dimensional grid system superimposed over it, such that all of the energy patterns contained within can be described in terms of three-dimensional geometry using mathematics to reduce the data to two-dimensional form. Bentov states that scientists suspect that the human mind operates on a simple binary, quote, go/no go, end quote, system as to do all digital computers. Therefore, once it superimposes a three-dimensional matrix over holographic information, it wishes to interpret and reduce that information mathematically to two-dimensional form. It can completely process it using its fundamental binary system, just as any computer made by the hand of man can process volumes of data and make various comparisons between the data and information stored in its digital memory. Our minds operate in the same way, perceiving by comparison only. Bentov states the proposition this way, quote, our whole reality is constructed by constantly making such comparisons. Whenever we perceive something, we always perceive differences only, end quote. In states of expanded consciousness, the right hemisphere of the human brain, in its holistic, nonlinear, and nonverbal mode of functioning, acts as the primary matrix or receptor for this holographic input, while, by operating in phase or coherence with the right brain, the left hemisphere provides the secondary matrix through its binary, computer-like method of functioning to screen further the data by comparison and reduce it to a discrete two-dimensional form. 16. Evaluation. To the extent that Gateway succeeds in bringing about a refinement in energy matrix of the mind, it succeeds in expanding or altering human consciousness so that it can perceive without recourse to the intercession of the physical senses, such that ever more of the universal hologram, not of course accessible by sense perception, can ultimately be perceived and understood. Marlon Ferguson has written that the theories of Pribram and Bohm, quote, appear to account for all transcendental experience, paranormal events, and even, quote, normal, end quote, perceptual oddities, end quote. She goes on to say of Pribram, quote, currently he is proposing a startling, all-encompassing model that is generating considerable excitement among those intrigued by the mysteries of human consciousness. His, quote, holographic model, end quote, marries brain research to theoretical physics. It accounts for normal perception and simultaneously takes the paranormal and transcendental experiences out of the supernatural by explaining them as a part of nature. Like certain strange discoveries of quantum physics, the radical reorientation of this theory suddenly makes sense of paradoxical sayings of mystics throughout the ages, end quote. 17. Self-cognition. To complete our outline of the process by which the mind achieves and exercises consciousness, we must also describe the mechanism which accounts for the aspect of human thought that differentiates it from the consciousness of plants or animals, i.e., self-cognition. Humans not only know, but they know that they know. They are able to monitor the process of their own thinking and maintain an awareness of it. Moreover, they can conduct a comparative. End of page 11, beginning page 12. So, as a note, page 12 does not continue the main text. It just has this illustration of a human head and 3 squares, presumably an X, Y, and Z axis. It says on the top, the functions of brain hemispheres in consciousness. And above the diagram or depiction, conscious energy grid. To the left side it says, left hemisphere consciousness grid. Underneath it says, acts like the mind's computer software to reduce input from right hemisphere to verbal symbols and concepts. And on the right it says, right hemisphere consciousness grid reduces 3-dimensional homographic images to 2-dimensional go/no-go. I assume that says form, because it just has letters F, O, and a cutoff. And that's page 12, beginning page 13, resuming the main reading. So I'll just start over from the last sentence on page 11. Moreover, they can conduct a comparative, back to page 13, assessment, evaluating the function of their thought processes against various, quote, objective, end quote, standards they have adopted. Human consciousness can do this because it has the capacity to duplicate aspects of its own hologram, project them, Human consciousness can do this because it has the capacity to duplicate aspects of its own hologram, project them out, quote, perceive, end quote, that projection, put it through comparison with the memory aspect, where, quote, sense, end quote, where its evaluation standards of measure are stored, of its own hologram, and measure, or, quote, sense, end quote, the differences using 3-dimensional geometry, and then binary, quote, go/no-go, end quote, pulse to yield verbal cognition about the self. 18. Time-space dimension. Up to this point, our discussion of the gateway process has been relatively simple and easy to follow. Now the fun begins. Gateway involves more than just perception of those aspects of the universal hologram which can be accessed in the dimension of time-space as we know it. To explain how and why consciousness can be brought to transcend the limitations of time-space is the next task which must be addressed. To do this, we must first appreciate what time and space are in order to understand how the dimension that they constitute can be transcended. Physicists define time as a measure of energy or force in motion. In other words, it is a measurement of change. However, in order for energy to be in motion, it must first be limited in some way, within the confines of some sort of vibratory pattern, so that its confinement gives it the capacity for being contained at a specific location, which is distinguishable from other locations. Space. Energy, which is not confined, is force without limit, without dimension, without the limits of form. It is infinity, cannot move because there is nothing beyond infinity, and is therefore outside of the dimension of time. It is also beyond space because that concept implies that a specific energy form is limited to a specific location and is absent from other locations. But if energy is in the state of infinity, there are no boundaries, no, quote, here, end quote, to differentiate from, quote, there, end quote, no sense of area. Energy in infinity means energy uniformly extended, without limit. It has no beginning, no end, no location. It is conscious force. the fundamental primal power of existence without form, a state of infinite being. Energy in infinity is said to be completely at rest, and therefore cannot generate holograms so long as it remains utterly inactive. It retains its inherent capacity for consciousness, in that it can receive and passively perceive holograms generated by energy in motion out in the various dimensions which make up the created universe, but it cannot be perceived by consciousness operating in the active universe. Energy in this state of inactive infinity is termed by physicists as energy in its absolute state, or simply, quote, the absolute, end quote. Between the absolute and the, quote, material, end quote, universe, in which we experience our physical existence, are various intervening dimensions to which human consciousness, in altered states of being, may gain access. Theoretically, human consciousness may continue to expand the horizons of its perceptual capability until it reaches the dimension of the absolute, at which point perception stops because the absolute generates no holograms of or about itself. 19. Intervening dimensions. Since the absolute is conscious energy in infinity, i.e. without boundaries, it occupies every dimension to include the time-space dimension in which we have our physical existence, but we cannot perceive it. It overlays everything as to do many of the intervening gradients or dimensions through which the energies of the universe pass on their way to and from their home, through which the energies of the universe pass on their way to and from their home in the state of infinity, the absolute. To enter these intervening dimensions, human consciousness must focus with such intense coherence that the frequency of the energy pattern which comprises that consciousness, i.e. brainwave output, can accelerate to a point where the resulting frequency pattern, if displayed on an oscilloscope, would look virtually like a solid line. Achievement of this state of altered consciousness sets the stage for perception of non-time-space dimensions because of the operation of a principle in physics known as Planck's distance. End of page 13, beginning page 14. This is an aspect of quantum mechanics which applies to the fact that any oscillating frequency, such as a brainwave, reaches 2 points of complete rest, which constitute the boundaries of each individual oscillation, i.e., movement up or down. Without these points of rest, an oscillating wave pattern would be impossible, since the points of rest are required to permit the energy to change direction and thus continue vibrating between rigid limits. But it is also true that when, for an infinitesimally brief instant, that energy really reaches one of its 2 points of rest, it, quote, clicks out, end quote, of time-space and joins infinity. See Exhibit 3, next page. That critical step out of time-space occurs when the speed of oscillation drops below 10 to the negative 33rd power centimeters per second. Planck's distance. To use the words of Bentov, quote, quantum mechanics tell us that when distances go below Planck's distance, which is 10 to the negative 33rd power centimeters, we enter, in effect, a new world. End quote. To return to our case in point, the human consciousness wave pattern reaches such high frequency that the pattern of, quote, clickouts, end quote, comes so close together that there is virtually continuity in it. Then a portion of that consciousness is actually postulated to establish and maintain its information collection function in those dimensions located between time-space and the absolute. Thus, as the almost continuous, quote, click-out, end quote, pattern establishes itself in continuous phase at speeds below Planck's distance, but before reaching the state of total rest, human consciousness passes through the looking glass of time-space after the fashion of Alice beginning her journey into Wonderland. The gateway experience with its associated hemisync technique is apparently designed, if used systematically and patiently, to enable human consciousness to establish a coherent pattern of perception in those dimensions, where speeds below Planck's distance apply. This holds true irrespective of whether the individual is exercising his consciousness while in his physical body, or whether he is doing so after having separated that consciousness from the physical body, i.e., the so-called out-of-body state mentioned earlier. 20. Subatomic particles. The behavior of subatomic particles provides an interesting example of the phenomenon of, quote, clicking out, end quote, discussed in the preceding paragraphs. In an article prepared for Scientific Digest magazine, Dr. John Gleedman mentions the way in which subatomic particles communicate with each other once their energy fields become entrained, as a result of colliding with each other. The communication concerned is, of course, postulated to be occurring during the, quote, click-out phase, end quote, in the oscillation of the energy fields comprising the subatomic particles concerned. It is this cause which accounts for the cross-communication at what, in terms of time-space velocities, would seem to involve speeds in excess of light. In reality, Einstein's theory of relativity is not being invalidated, but rather the communication concerned is taking place outside the dimension of time-space, to which the theory of relativity is strictly confined. Specifically, Dr. Gleedman tells us, quote, quantum theory postulates a kind of long-range Siamese twin effect whenever two subatomic particles collide and then go their different ways. Even when the particles are halfway across the universe from each other, it says they instantaneously respond to each other's actions, and in doing so, they violate relativity's ban on faster-than-light velocities. Indeed, regarding attempts to quantify what is known about the behavior of energy in dimensions apparently outside of time-space, Antov speaks about, quote, courageous physicists who are working on hypothetical particles called, in quote, tachyons, end in quote, which can move at speeds higher than light. The speed of tachyons starts just above the speed of light and ranges all the way to infinite velocities, end quote. 21. Dimensions in between. Now that we have postulated the legitimacy of the assertion that the energy forms which compose consciousness can move beyond the time-space dimension, we need to turn our attention to the energy forms, which, end of page 14, beginning page 15, skipping page 15 to finish the reading from page 14. Page 16. Inhabit those dimensions between time-space and the absolute. In doing so, we may better perceive the form that, quote, reality, end quote, assumes when we encounter it in those intermediate dimensions. In this context, Bentov tells us that, quote, the casual relationship between events breaks down. Movements become jerky rather than smooth. Time and space may become, quote, grainy, end quote, or, quote, chunky, end quote. Perhaps a piece of space can be traversed by a particle of matter in any direction without necessarily being synchronized with a piece of time. A pair of events will occur in either time or space. The pair is not being connected causally, but by a random fluctuation, end quote. What Bentov means is that inside the dimension of time-space, where both concepts apply in a generally uniform way, there is a proportional relationship between them. A certain space can be covered by energy moving in either particle or waveform in a certain time, assuming the specific velocity virtually anywhere in the time-space universe. The relationship is neat and predictable. However, in the intermediate dimensions beyond time-space, the limitations imposed on energy to put it into a state of oscillating motion are not uniform as they are in our physical universe. A myriad of various distortions and incongruities are thus likely to be encountered, such that our nice, neat assumptions concerning the relationship between time and space, as we know it, in this dimension do not apply. But even more important, access is opened to both the past and the future when the dimension of current time-space is left behind. So, that's the end of part 21. I'm going to return to page 15. So here's another diagram. It says on top of it, the absolute in infinity. So on the left and right hand side on the top of this drawing wave function, I don't know what you call it, you got the two symbols of infinity, and you have a line that strikes through. Right underneath it, you've got let me see, what is it called? It's called Planck's distance. So you have Planck's distance, which is 10 to the negative 33rd power centimeters, being right there. And then another line through. Between infinity and Planck's distance, you have, quote, clicked out, end quote, portion of oscillating energy traversing intermediate dimensions. Here it is, Planck's distance. It was just noted on the right-hand side. But, so this is a wave of what? I'm not sure. So on the far left side, you have energy, then you have oscillation, energy oscillation wave. Okay, that's what it is. And over here it says portion of oscillating energy pattern in time-space. And then, so near the top and near the bottom, you have the same note, which says again, quote, clicked out, end quote, portion of the oscillating energy in intermediate dimensions, and then once again Planck's distance 10 to the 33rd, negative 33rd power centimeters. Okay. So that's it. I intend to put the link in the description for anybody that wants to look at this, or if they're just comfortable at looking from the video. But I intend to resume the reading on section 22 on page 16 in part 2.